Hello, class. Welcome to our first distance learning that we're going to try to do. I know this is a weird time. We're not in our classroom. We're going to try to do the stuff that we do in class the best we can. I don't have all my teaching materials. We're just going to have to make do, and I'll learn this technology as it goes. You guys can learn how to better use technology as it goes, so we can get some good learning done. That being said, we obviously don't have any of our class novels, so we're going to start a new novel. It's one of the only ones I had here at home. It's called My Side of the Mountain. It's by Jean Craighead George. And this story is about a boy that leaves the city and he goes to live in the woods for about a year in his adventures that of him living in the woods. I prepared some slides to help us know. I'm going to demonstrate what good readers should do as they read, what I think, what I should picture in my head. And again, I'll share some slides. There's a few words in here that I didn't know. So when I came across those, I made a little slideshow. We'll jump back and forth if it's not too distracting. Then there is a quiz. If you have our Google Classroom, log into the Google Classroom. I made a Google sheet with multiple choice. You can go in there and click your answer, see your score. If you couldn't figure out how to do the Google Classroom or you don't have access to the Google Classroom, I'll put the questions in the description box of this video, and then just answer the comments in YouTube using the comments. You'll just have to comment in the video the answers to the questions. So you'd say like question 1, the answer is, and then put your answer, and I'll know that you watched the video and you're paying attention. So My Side of the Mountain. This book starts page 3. The name of this section is In Which I Hole Up in a Snowstorm. So sometimes when you get those title names like that, you think, I hole up in a snowstorm. So this first section probably has something to do with him surviving in a snowstorm. I am on my mountain in a tree home that people have passed without even knowing that I am here. The house is a hemlock tree, 6 feet in diameter, and must be as old as the mountains itself. I came upon it last summer and dug and burned it out until I made a snug cave in the tree that I now call home. So if any of you guys have ever seen a giant hemlock tree, they can get pretty big, and this was pretty common practice in the old days. People would make homes out of them. So here's a giant hemlock tree, and so this one's probably about double what that boy had. So that boy had 6 feet. This one's probably 12 feet. So he burned a hole in here, and then he was living in a cave that he made inside a tree. So you look at this guy. Imagine this guy making a cave to live inside that giant tree. Pretty cool. My bed is on the right as you enter, and it is made of ash slats and covered with deerskin. So I'm thinking of like boards, and a deerskin is kind of like leather. So if you imagine deer leather. On the left is a small fireplace about knee high. So I'm imagining a fireplace. It is of clay and stone. So I'm imagining like one of those fireplaces you might see on the back porch that are made out of clay, and inside's a little fire. It has a chimney that leads the smoke out through a knothole. I chipped out 3 other knotholes to let fresh air in. The air coming in is bitter cold. It must be below 0 outside, and yet I can sit here inside my tree and write with bare hands. The fire is small too. It doesn't take much to warm this tree room. So if you think about the little cave, you know, it's pretty cramped space. He probably doesn't need much to stay warm. If you've ever been inside a cave or a tunnel, I imagine that in my head times that I've been in a small confined space, you know, and it's very cozy and warm in there. It is the 4th of December, I think. It may be the 5th. I am not sure because I have not recently counted the notches in the aspen pole that is my calendar. So, an aspen pole, again, if you don't know what the aspen is, it might be hard to imagine this. So, this boy is using this wood right here. This white wood is aspen. Okay, and when it's nice and white, and when you mark on it, it's kind of like paper, and it's really easy to carve in it and knot on it. So he's making notches to keep track of the time he spent in that cave. It says it is the 4th of okay. I have been just too busy gathering nuts, berries, smoking venison, fish, and small game to keep up with the exact date. So I made a video of some of his food here. So he collected nuts and berries. These are like wild berries. They're a little different than the berries you get at the store. They look a little bit different. They're not as sweet. Venison is deer. Here's all the pictures of the deer. And this is a trout. This is a small fish. You can catch them in streams around here. The lamp I am writing by is by deer fat poured into a turtle shell with a strip of my old city trousers for a wick. So imagine a turtle shell, and oil actually burns. So he got the oil from the deer he killed, burned it down, made liquid out of it, and then he has a wick, like imagine a candle wick, and the wick is just a strip of clothes, and he's lighting that on fire, and it works almost just like a candle. It snowed all day yesterday and today. I've not been outside since the storm began, and I am bored for the first time since I ran from home 8 months ago to live on the land. Imagine that. That boy ran away 8 months ago. That's a long time. I am well and healthy. The food is good. Sometimes I eat turtle soup. So I've never had turtle soup, but I imagine it tastes something like chicken soup because everything kind of tastes like chicken. And I know how to make acorn pancakes. So I wonder what would acorn pancakes taste like. So then in my head, I think about pancakes, and acorns have to be kind of like nutty. So I imagine like a nutty pancake flavor. I keep my supplies in the wall of the tree in wooden pockets that I chopped myself. Every time I've looked at those pockets during the last 2 days, I have felt just like a squirrel, which reminds me, I didn't see a squirrel one whole day before the storm began. I guess they are holed up and eating their stored nuts too. I wonder if the Baron, that's the wild weasel who lives behind the big boulder to the north of my tree, is also denned up. Well, anyways, I think the storm is dying down because the tree is not crying so much. When the wind really blows, the whole tree moans right down to the roots, which is where I am. So in my head, I'm like, the tree is crying. Well, then I think I'm like, hey, do trees really cry? And of course they don't really cry. They don't have eyes. They don't have emotions. But if you've ever heard a tree in the wind, it kind of makes a weird noise, creaking noise. So that's what he's saying. It sounds like the crying is the sound that that tree's making in the storm when it's windy. Tomorrow, I hope the Baron, and remember the Baron's the weasel, and I can tunnel out into the sunlight. I wonder if I should dig the snow, but that would mean I'd have to put it somewhere. And the only place to put it is in my nice snug tree. Maybe I can pack it with my hands. And as I go, I've always dug into the snow from the top, never from under. The Baron must dig up from under the snow. I wonder where he puts what he digs. Well, I guess I'll know in the morning. When I wrote that last winter, I was scared and thought maybe I'd never get out of my tree. I'd been scared for 2 days, ever since the first blizzard hit the Catskill Mountains. So that's the name of the mountains where he's staying at, the Catskill. Like we have the Olympics here and the Cascades. where he's from, the state he's from, those mountains are the Catskill Mountains. When I came up to the sunlight, which I did by simply poking my head into the soft snow and standing up, I laughed at my dark fears. Everything was white, clean, shining, and beautiful. The sky was blue, blue. The hemlock grove was laced with snow. The meadow was smooth and white, and the gorge was sparkling with ice. It was so beautiful and peaceful that I laughed out loud. I guess I laughed because my first snowstorm was over, and I had not been so terrible after all. Then I shouted, I did it! My voice never got very far. It was hushed by the tone of the snow. So, guys, now I'm thinking when a snow day happens. So, imagine when a snow day happens, you get up early in the morning, you look outside, and just everything's covered with snow. And then you go outside, and it's so quiet because nobody's out there driving, nobody's out there making sound. And the snow kind of makes the sounds more quiet because it acts like almost like a cushion sucking up all the sound. I looked for signs from the Baron Weasel. His footsteps were all over the boulder. Also, slides where he had played. He must have been up for hours enjoying the new snow. So now I'm imagining a little weasel playing in the snow. And when we get to another part, I did make some pictures of a weasel. If you don't know what a weasel looks like, then you can better imagine that in your head in the future when we read more about this weasel. Inspired by his fun, I poked my head into my tree and whistled. Frightful, my trained falcon. Oh, wow, he has a trained falcon. So now I'm trying to think in my head, oh, what does a falcon look like? Flew to my fist, and he jumped and slid down the mountain, making a big holes and trenches as he went. It was good to be whistling and carefree again because I was sure scared by the coming of that storm. And here is, I don't know if I'll get this in here. Here's the picture that the book has. And it's the boy. I don't know if it'll show up here. It's of the boy coming out of his cave with his falcon on his hand. And then I have some pictures here. Let's go back to my slideshow. So this is a picture of the Catskill Mountains here where this boy lives. And this is what I imagine. I've been in the mountains a lot. If you haven't, this is kind of what the mountains look like. They're really beautiful, and you look out and you can see really far away. I looked up where the Catskill Mountains are. They're in the state of New York, and a lot of people kind of get confused and they think New York City is the whole state. New York City is not the whole state. New York City is like down around here. And this little patch of green right here is actually the Catskill Mountains. Okay, so he's kind of just right outside the city in this giant mountains. And New York actually has a lot of mountains, which a lot of people don't know. Here's his pets. This is that wild weasel that he calls Baron. Okay, this is the type of weasel he'd be. So you can imagine this weasel playing in the snow. This is his falcon, his pet falcon. And he actually trained this falcon to help him, that we'll see later on in the book. Okay, let me switch back here to this. Okay. I've been working since May, learning how to make a fire with flint and steel. And we have a thing in there later on. Flint and steel comes into play a lot. It's actually like two pieces of metal you flick and it makes sparks. Okay, so I have that later on in the slideshow. We'll stop and we'll check it out. And finding what plants I could eat, how to trap animals and catch fish. All this so that when the curtain of blizzard struck the Catskills, I could crawl inside my tree and be comfortable, warm, and have plenty to eat. So when you're in the winter in the woods, there's not a lot of food, not a lot of animals, not a lot of berries. So you have to gather all that stuff up when the weather's nice, and then you have to store it so you have it over the winter like a squirrel. That's what he said earlier when he's like, he felt like a squirrel saving all that stuff. During the summer and fall, I had thought about the coming of winter. However, on the third day of December, when the sky blackened, the temperature dropped, and the first flakes swirled around me, I must admit that I wanted to run back to New York. And he means New York City there. Remember, he's still in New York State. We want to go back to New York City. Even the first night that I spent out in the woods, when I couldn't get the fire started, was not frightening as the snowstorm that gathered behind the gorge and mushroomed in over my mountain. So I just imagine the storm rolling in, and it wasn't actually a mushroom, but it looked like a mushroom. So think about a big top, right? The mushroom has a nice round top. Think about that rolling towards him as he's up there on that mountain that we just looked at, overlooking, and you can watch the clouds roll in, and they roll almost like that top of a mushroom. I was smoking 3 trout. It was 9 o'clock in the morning. I was busy keeping the flames low so they would not leap up and burn the fish. As I worked, it occurred to me that it was awfully dark for that hour of the morning. Frightful was leashed to her tree stub. Remember, Frightful is that falcon that we looked at. She seemed restless and pulled at her tethers. Tethers are like leather strips that tie that bird to something so it doesn't fly off. Then I realized that the forest was dead quiet. Even the woodpeckers that had been tapping around me all morning were silent. And woodpeckers go if you ever heard them pecking on something, they're really loud. The squirrels were nowhere to be seen. The juncos and chickadees and nuthatches were gone. I looked to see what the Baron Weasel was doing. He was not around. I looked up. So those 3 words, juncos, chickadees, and nuthatches, I wasn't sure what those were. So I looked them up. And again, I do this a lot when I read. I'm like, I kind of knew what a chickadee was. So I looked up the other 2. This is a junco, like a little gray bird. This one is a nuthatch, and this one is a chickadee. And chickadee I knew was a little bird because we have them around here. And they sing a song, they go chickadee dee 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 as they sing, and that's why they're called a chickadee, for that sound they make. From my tree, you can see the gorge beyond the meadow. White water pours between the black, wet boulders and cascades into the valley below. The water that day was as dark as the rocks. Only the sound told me it was still falling. Above the darkness stood another darkness, the clouds of winter, black and fearsome. They looked as wild as the winds that were bringing them. I grew sick with fright. I knew I had enough food. I knew everything was going to be perfectly all right, but knowing that didn't help. I was scared. I stamped out the fire and pocketed the fish. Tried to whistle for Frightful, but couldn't. Pursed my shaking lips tight enough to get out anything but. So I grabbed her by the hide straps that are attached to her legs, and we drove through the deerskin door into my room in the tree. I put Frightful on the bedpost and curled up in a ball on the bed. I thought about New York and the noise and the lights and how a snowstorm always seemed very friendly there. I thought about our apartment too. At that moment, it seemed bright and lighted and warm. I had to keep saying to myself, there are 11 of us in it. So imagine 11 people living in a little apartment. That might get old, right? Dad, mother, 4 sisters, 4 brothers, and me. And not one of us liked it, except perhaps little Nina, who was too young to know. Dad didn't like it even a little bit. He had been a sailor once, but when I was born, he gave up the sea and worked on the docks in New York. Dad didn't like the land. He liked the sea. Wet, big, and endless. So that's kind of an interesting detail. His dad used to be a sailor. And when you're a sailor, you're out at sea quite a bit. So when you have a family, it's hard to keep being a sailor because you want to be with your family and not be away all the time. Sometimes they tell me about great grandfather Gribbly. So Gribbly is their last name. who owned land in the Catskill Mountains. Remember, that's where he's at now. Felled the trees and built a home and plowed the land, only to discover that he wanted to be a sailor. So his great granddad was a sailor too, and his great granddad is whose land he's on now. The farm felled, and great grandfather Gribbly went to sea. As I lay with my face buried in the sweet, greasy smell of my deer skin. So a sweet, greasy smell. I'm trying to imagine what that would smell like. And so I imagine like almost smelling like a piece of meat or something. I could hear Dad's voice saying that land is still in the family's name. Somewhere in the Catskills is an old beech with the name Gribbly carved on it. And beechwood is like that other white wood that we saw. It marks the northern boundary of Gribbly's Folly. The land is no place for a Gribbly. So folly means like a mistake. So Gribbly's Folly would be like Gribbly's mistake. The land is no place for a Gribbly, I said. The land is no place for a Gribbly. And here I am, 300 feet from the beach with Gribbly carved on it. I fell asleep at that point, and when I woke, I was hungry. I cracked some walnuts, got down the acorn flour I had pounded with a bit of ash to remove the bite, reached out the door for a little snow, and stirred up some acorn pancakes. Put them on top of a tin can, and as I ate them, smothered with blueberry jam, I knew that the land was just the place for Gribbly. So he's living in this tree, and he doesn't have any pots or pans, so he's using a top of a can, and then he's just putting that on the fire, and then he's using it kind of as a little makeshift frying pan. In which I get started on this adventure. This is the next section. I left New York in May, and remember that's New York City. I had a penknife, a ball of cord, an axe, and $40, which I had saved from selling magazine subscriptions. And you think about that, that's not very many things to bring into the woods when you're running away. A knife, cord, an axe, and $40. I mean, I would have brought food, a sleeping bag, a coat, some matches. I would have brought all that stuff, not just that few things. I also had some flint and steel, and there's that flint and steel again. We'll look at that later, which I had bought at a Chinese store in the city. The man in the store had showed me how to use it. He had also given me a little purse to put it in and some tinder to catch the sparks. He had told me that if I ran out of tinder, I should burn cloth and use the charred ashes. I thanked him and said, "This is the kind of thing I am not going to forget." On the train north to the Catskills, I unwrapped my flint and steel and practiced hitting them together to make sparks. On the wrapping paper, I made these notes. So when you hit the flint and steel together, like one's like a rod, and then you have like a striker. When you strike it, a bunch of sparks come out, and you want to catch that onto like paper or something fluffy, like beard hair or something, and then it'll make a spark, and you blow on it, and then you can put little twigs and build up your fire. A hard, brisk strike is best. Remember to hold the steel in the left hand and the flint in the right, and hit the steel with flint. The trouble is the sparks go every which way. So when you hit it, it's not like a match where it's an instant fire. It's just sparks shoot out of this. And that was the trouble. I did not get a fire going that night. And as I mentioned, this was a scary experience. I hitched rides into the Catskill Mountains. At about 4 o'clock, a truck driver and I passed through a beautiful dark hemlock forest. And I said to him, "This is as far as I'm going." He looked all around and said, "You live here?" "No," I said, "but I am running away from home. And this is just the kind of forest I've always dreamed I would run to. I think I'll camp here tonight." I hopped out of the cab. So think about it. He got a ride. First, he took the train by himself, and then he got a ride from some guy driving a truck he doesn't know. So obviously, this book wasn't written in today's times, because in today's times, I hope all you kids would know you should not probably take the train by yourself, and you should not get into the truck with somebody you don't know. Okay, so all that stuff was not very safe. But also, running to live in the woods isn't very safe. So you can tell this was written in kind of the olden days. I think this is supposed to have taken place about 40 years ago or so. Hey, boy, the driver shouted. Are you serious? Sure, I said. Well, now, ain't that something? You know, when I was your age, I did the same thing. Only thing was, I was a farm boy and ran to the city, and you're a city boy running to the woods. I was scared of the city. You think you'll be scared of the woods? Heck no, I shouted loudly. As I marched in the cool, shadowy woods, I heard the driver call to me. I'll be back in the morning if you want to ride home. He laughed. Everybody laughed at me, even Dad. I told Dad that I was going to run away to great-grandfather Gribley's land. He had roared with laughter and told me about the time he had run away from home. He got on a boat headed for Singapore, but when the whistle blew for departure, he was down the gangplank and home in bed before anyone knew he was gone. Then he told me, sure, go try it. Everybody should try it. So the gangplank's like a board that leads onto the ship. So when he ran down the gangplank, that means he ran off the ship before it sailed away to Singapore, which is pretty far away. Okay. I must have walked a mile into the woods until I found a stream. It was a clear, athletic stream that rushed and ran and jumped and splashed. Ferns grew along its banks, and its rocks were upholstered with moss. So again, I picked a picture of this out just so we could know. So I have seen lots of streams. I like to go hiking a lot, but an athletic stream, that's kind of a weird way to describe a stream. But it said it jumped and got water around. So imagine like a stream like this with water splashing around and moss and trees on either side there. I sat down, smelled the piney air, and took out my penknife. I cut off a green twig and began to whittle. I've always been good at whittling. I carved a ship once that my teacher exhibited for parents' night at school. So whittling's something we used to do before we had video games and stuff. We would get a little knife, and it's basically like carving, but you carve a little piece of wood. That's called whittling, and you can carve animals or whatever. This boy, and this does not want to show up good. This boy ends up carving like a fishing hook, but you can whittle anything. You have to be careful. I cut my fingers a lot when I was a kid whittling, so make sure you're doing it safe. First, I whittled an angle on one end of the twig. Then I cut a smaller twig and sharpened it to a point. I whittled an angle on that twig and bound the two angles face to face with a strip of green bark. It was supposed to be a fish hook. According to a book on how to survive on the land that I read in the New York Public Library, this was the way to make your own hooks. I then dug for worms. I had hardly chopped the moss away with my axe before I hit frost. It had not occurred to me that there would be frost in the ground in May. But then I had not been on a mountain before. This did worry me because I was depending on fish to keep me alive until I got to my great-grandfather's mountain, where I was going to make traps and catch game. I looked into the stream to see what else I could eat, and as I did, my hand knocked a rotten log apart. I remembered about old logs and all the sleeping stages of insects that are in it. I chopped away until I found a cold white grub. And the grub is like a bug baby. It kind of looks like a jelly bean. You've ever seen that before? They're not very cute looking. I swiftly tied a string to my hook, put the grub on, and walked upstream looking for a good place to fish. All the manuals I had read were very emphatic about where fish live. Emphatic means like they're very like tell you where they live. Hey, this is the spot where they live. Emphatic means they're telling you a fact. And so I had memorized this. In stream, fish usually congregate in pools in deep, calm water. So congregate means like group together. So fish like to group together. The heads of riffles, small rapids, the tail of a pool, eddies below rocks or logs, deep undercut banks, and the shade of overhanging bushes, all are very likely places to fish. This stream did not seem to have any calm water, and I must have walked 1,000 miles before I found a pool by a deep undercut bank in the shade of an overhanging bushes. Actually, it wasn't that far. It just seemed that way because I went looking and finding nothing. I was sure I was going to starve to death. I squatted on the bank and dropped in my line. I did so want to catch a fish. One fish would set upon my way because I had read how much you can learn from one fish. By examining the contents of its stomach, you can find out what the other fish are eating, or you can use the internal organs as bait. I don't know. Do you guys think that'd be good bait? The grub went down to the bottom of the stream, swirled around, and hung still. Suddenly, the string came to life and rode back and forth and around in a circle. I pulled with a powerful jerk. The hook came apart, and whatever I had went circling back to its bed. So if you guys have ever been fishing, when a fish comes on, your line starts spinning around and dancing around, and then you have to jerk on the line, and then it hooks. The hook will catch their cheek or whatever, and then you can reel it in. So he tried to pull on it and get that hook into that fish's cheek, and the hook fell apart because if you remember, he made it out of wood and pieces of bark, and that's probably not the most stable thing to use as a fishing hook. And there is another picture. I'll try to show it here, get it to show up. Ooh, this does not want to work good. So there's that boy down there fishing. Well, that almost made me cry. My bait was gone, my hook was broken, and I was getting cold, frightened, and mad. I whittled another hook, but this time I cheated and used string to wind it together instead of bark. So remember, he had that cord with him so he could tie it instead of using bark. I walked back to the log and luckily found another grub. I hurried to the pool and I flipped a trout out of the water before I knew I had a bite. So he's just catching those fish. He dropped the hook right in before it even barely got in. He pricked out a fish. The fish flopped and I threw my whole body over it. I could not bear to think of it flopping itself back into the stream. And if you guys have ever gone fishing, when you get the fish on the shore, it like flop around like crazy. So he jumped on that thing because he was really scared it was going to get away. I cleaned it like I had seen the man at the fish market do, examined its stomach and found it empty. This horrified me. What I didn't know was that an empty stomach means the fish are hungry and will eat about anything. However, I thought at that time that I was a goner. Sadly, I put some of the internal organs on my hook, and before I could get my line to the bottom, I had another bite. I lost that one, but got the next one. I stopped when I had 5 nice little trout and looked around for a place to build a camp and make a fire. I got 5 trout. That's a pretty good meal. Even, they're probably not very big, but if you had 5 of them, that would be pretty good. It wasn't hard to find a pretty spot along the stream. I selected a place beside a mossy rock in a circle of hemlock. I decided to make a bed before I cooked. Cut off some boughs for a mattress. And boughs are tree branches. A big tree branch is a bough. And they have to still have like the kind of like the leaves on them. Then I leaned some dead limbs against the boulder and covered them with hemlock limbs. This made a kind of tent. Crawled in and lay down and felt alone and secret and very excited. But the rest of the story was on the northeast side of the mountain. It grew dark and cold early. Seeing the shadows slide down on me, I frantically round and around gathering firewood. This is about the only thing I did right from that moment until dawn, because I remembered that the driest wood in the forest is the dead limbs that are still on the trees. I gathered an enormous pile of them. That pile must still be there, for I never got a fire going. And if you guys have ever been in the woods at night, it gets really cold. So that boy must have been freezing to not get a fire going. So, oh no. Let's see, this thing logged me out here, which is not great. Let's see if I can get back to my slideshow. Okay. So when you go into the woods, the most important thing you probably can do is get shelter and get a fire going. So he had a really hard time getting the fire going, but then also this is a shelter. So these are bows made out of the hemlock. Hemlock is kind of like the evergreen, and he made kind of a little tent here out of that. So he gathered up the woods, that dried wood. Now he's going to try to make a fire. I got sparks, sparks, sparks. I even hit the tinder with the sparks. The tinder burned all right, but that was as far as I got. I blew on it. I breathed on it. I cupped it in my hands, but no sooner did I add twigs than the whole thing went black. Then it got too dark to see. I clicked steel and flint together, even though I couldn't see the tinder. Finally, I gave up and crawled into my hemlock tent, hungry, cold, and miserable. So I couldn't get the fire going. It's really hard to get that fire going with flint and steel. If you guys have ever tried it, it's hard to get a fire going with matches and a lighter. So trying to do it in the cold when you're scared, definitely a hard thing. I can talk about the first night now, although it is still embarrassing to me because I'm so stupid and scared that I hate to admit it. I had made my hemlock bed right in the stream valley where the wind drained down from the cold mountaintop. It might have been all right if I had made it on the other side of the boulder, but I didn't. It was on the main highway of the cold winds as they tore down upon the valley below. I didn't have enough hemlock boughs under me, and before I had my head down, my stomach was cold and damp. So an important thing is when you try to sleep outside, you need something between you and the ground. The ground gets really cold. So he was stacking these branches on the ground, but there wasn't enough of them, and he ended up getting wet. So now he's wet and cold. It's the middle of the night. I took some boughs off of the roof and stuffed them under me, and then my shoulder was cold, curled up in a ball, and was almost asleep when a whippoorwill called. And when I read that, I was like, well, what the heck is a whippoorwill? If you ever been within 40 feet of a whippoorwill, you will understand why I couldn't even shut my eyes. They are deafening. I thought a whippoorwill was like some wind, but then I looked it up, and a whippoorwill is actually this funny looking bird, and they make, I guess, a really distinct sound. I actually have a little video here. So apparently they're really loud and they make this sound. So the boy finally started getting comfortable, and then this bird, this weird bird, I guess, comes out at night and makes these weird noises. So I didn't know that. So even Mr. Zappy can learn something. Well, anyways, the whole night went like that. I don't think I slept 15 minutes, and I was so scared and tired that my throat was dry. I wanted to drink, but didn't dare go near the stream for fear of making a misstep and falling in and getting wet. So I sat tight and shivered and shook. Now I am able to say I cried a little tiny bit. Fortunately, the sun has a wonderful, glorious habit of rising every morning. When the sky lightened, when the birds awoke, I knew I'd never again see anything so splendid as the round sun coming up over the earth. Imagine that, freezing all night, just sitting there waiting for the sun. That must have been a really hard time that boy was going through. I was immediately cheered and set out directly for the highway. Somehow I thought that if I was a little nearer the road, everything would be all right. I climbed a hill and stopped. There was a house with a warm and cozy, with smoke coming out of the chimney and lights in the windows, only 100 feet from my torture camp. All night he sat out there freezing, and right down the road was this house. So imagine that boy. You're sitting there tortured, freezing to death, and then right down the road's this nice house. Without considering my pride, I ran down the hill and banged on the door. A nice old man answered. I told him everything in one long sentence, and then said, "And so can I cook my fish here, because I haven't eaten in years?" He chuckled, stroked his whiskered face, and took the fish. He had them cooking in a pan before I knew what his name was. When I asked him, he said Bill something, but I never heard his last name because I fell asleep in his rocking chair that was pulled up beside his big, hot, glorious wood stove in the kitchen. I ate the fish some hours later, also some bread, jelly, oatmeal, and cream. Then he said to me, "Sam Gribley, if you're going to run off and live in the woods, better learn how to make a fire. Come with me." So that boy's name is Sam Gribley. I believe this is the first time that we actually learned. We learned his last name was Gribley, but now we know his name is Sam. And he meets up with this old man. I'm just imagining a nice old man with a beard. Uh, Imagine your grandpa or some other old person that you think is friendly, and then imagine them with a beard. We spent the afternoon practicing. We spent the afternoon practicing. I penciled these notes on the back of a scrap of paper so I wouldn't forget. When the tinder glows, keep blowing and add fine dry needles one by one, and keep blowing steadily, lightly and evenly. Add 1 inch dried twigs to the needles, and then give her a good big handful of small dry stuff. Keep blowing. So the old man decided to teach Sam how to build a fire, which is probably a good thing, because that is something he's going to need if he lives in the woods. Let's get out of this one. I made our last one is about flint and tinder. So this is the flint and steel. So this is the flint. It's kind of like a rock, but you shave it off, and then you can make a little pile of it, and then you strike it, and it makes sparks, and hopefully you can pick that up. I also linked a video here of this. Sorry, I had this skip, guys, but I guess it wants to make me watch it again. See how it makes those sparks? And they always look different, but that's the same principle no matter what it is. And then this is this dry stuff that looks like dried moss or something. See how he's shooting those sparks in there? And that's called tinder. This dry stuff's tinder. And then it starts to spark up like that. And then you need to blow it together there. So he's putting the little twigs and stuff on there now. And the hardest part about a fire is getting it started initially. And we're going to stop that there, guys. This is the end of our first reading lesson. I know it went a little long. Hopefully my timing will be a little better as this goes. Again, I'll post a quiz for what we read in the Google Classroom. I'll also post the questions in the description of this video on YouTube. So if you can't figure out how to get into Google Classroom, you can ask me for help when we're doing our Zoom meeting. I'll try to help you. If you still can't figure it out, just post the answers in the comment section to this video. It's nice to see you guys, and I'll make one more of these for the first week, and then we'll move on to some writing stuff probably next week. So stay safe, you guys, and I'll see you in our Zoom meeting.